There is a palace on a bend of the Thames in Surrey, 12 miles southwest of central London, where the river mist rises off the water on autumn mornings and lies against half a mile of red Tudor brick like a held breath. You reach it across the bridge at East Molesey, past gates crowned with the king's beasts, and the building arrives all at once. This is Hampton Court, and no photograph prepares you for the scale of it. A great gatehouse of crimson brick laid 500 years ago in patterns of charred blue. A skyline crowded with twisted chimneys, no two alike. 60 acres of formal gardens, 750 acres of deer park running down to the river. Beyond the gatehouse lie two palaces stitched into one, the Tudor courtyards of Base Court and Clock Court at the front, and behind them, facing the gardens, a baroque quadrangle of pink brick and white Portland stone that would not look out of place outside Paris. Above the inner gateway, an astronomical clock made in 1540 still turns, blue and gold, and still shows the hour the tide will turn at London Bridge. What you are looking at is a crime scene that has been open to the public since 1838. Not a fortress, not a folly, not a stately home gone quietly to seed. Hampton Court is where a Queen of England gave the king his longed-for son and was dead 12 days later, and where her heart is buried beneath the chapel. It is where a girl of about 17, queen for barely 18 months, is said to have broken free of her guards and run screaming down a gallery towards a locked chapel door, and where visitors standing on that same stretch of floor have fainted on the same spot. It is where the most powerful commoner in England gave away the greatest private house in the kingdom to save his own life, and lost both. It is where one king was held prisoner by his own army, and another was killed by a molehill. And it is where, one October night in 2003, a security camera recorded a set of fire doors bursting open, and a figure in period robes stepping out of the darkness to close them. This is the dark story of Britain's most haunted royal palace, Hampton Court. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a butcher's son from Ipswich. Thomas Wolsey was born in Ipswich around 1473, the son of Robert Wolsey, a butcher and cattle dealer whose name survives in the town records, chiefly because he kept breaking its trading rules. The son was clever in a way that unsettled people. He took his Oxford degree at 15 and was called the boy bachelor. Ordained a priest in 1498, he worked his way into the court of Henry VII and mastered the one skill that mattered more than birth in Tudor England, making himself indispensable to the man on the throne. Almost everything we know of his private hours comes from George Cavendish, the gentleman usher who served him for years, and, decades later, wrote the first great English biography about his fallen master. The old king died in 1509. The new one was 17, magnificent, and allergic to paperwork. Henry VIII wanted to hunt, joust, write music, and make war on France. Somebody had to run the country, and Wolsey ran it. By 1514, he was Archbishop of York. In 1515, the Pope gave him a cardinal's hat, and the king gave him the Lord Chancellorship of England. For the next 14 years, the butcher's son from Ipswich was, in everything but name, the government. In 1514, he took a 99-year lease on a quiet riverside manor belonging to the Knights Hospitaller of St. John at East Molesey in Surrey. The Knights had valued the place for its sweet air, its fresh springs, and its position on the tidal Thames, a few hours by barge from Westminster on a good flood. Wolsey valued it for what it could become, and then he began to build. What rose at Hampton Court between 1514 and 1528 was not a house. It was an argument, made in brick, that blood counted for less than brains. Base Court alone held 40 double lodgings for guests, each one finer than the manor houses most English knights lived and died in. The gatehouse stood 5 stories tall. In 1521, Wolsey commissioned the Florentine sculptor Giovanni da Maiano to make terracotta roundels of the Roman emperors and set them into the brickwork so that visitors passed beneath the faces of Augustus and Hadrian on their way to see a butcher's son. Fresh drinking water ran 3.5 miles from the springs at Combe Hill, carried in lead pipes laid beneath the bed of the Thames. Hundreds of rooms were kept hung with silk and tapestry for guests who might never come. Nearly 500 servants wore the cardinal's livery. By the 1520s, Hampton Court was the greatest private residence in England, grander than anything the king himself owned. Foreign ambassadors said so in their dispatches, which was flattering. Londoners said so in the street, which was dangerous. The poet, John Skelton, set the problem to rhyme for anyone too slow to see it. Why come you not to court? To which court? To the King's Court or to Hampton Court? In Henry VIII's England, there was only one safe answer to that question. Wolsey had built the wrong one. For a decade, splendour worked. In the autumn of 1527, Wolsey feasted the ambassadors of France for days on gold plate, and his gentleman usher, George Cavendish, who saw it all and later wrote it all down, recorded banquets that left hardened diplomats groping for words. The house was doing what it was built to do. It was announcing that its master had no rival beneath the throne. Then the king fell in love. By 1527, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon stood cursed by Scripture, and that Anne Boleyn would give him the son God was withholding. All he required was a papal annulment. But Pope Clement VII was at that moment a prisoner in everything but name of the Emperor Charles V, whose troops had just sacked Rome, and who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Wolsey, who had delivered everything the king wanted for 20 years, could not deliver this. He could read weather better than any man in England, and he knew what was coming. In 1528, he made the largest gift in English history. He handed Hampton Court to the king. The palace, the plate, the tapestries, the silk hangings, the beds the ambassadors had slept in, everything. It bought him 2 years. In October 1529, he was indicted under the statute of Praemunire and surrendered the Great Seal of England. His goods were declared forfeit. He withdrew north to York, the diocese he had held for 15 years without once visiting it. In November 1530, he was arrested for high treason and ordered south to London, to the Tower. He never arrived. He fell ill on the road, and on 29th November 1530, in a guest chamber of Leicester Abbey, Thomas Wolsey died before the king could kill him. Cavendish knelt at the bedside and wrote down his master's final verdict on his own life. Had I but served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs. The king kept the house. He had, in truth, already moved in. In the winter nights of the early 1530s, travellers on the Thames could see Hampton Court glowing in the dark. Henry VIII wanted a great hall worthy of the mightiest prince in Christendom, and he wanted it at once, so the masons and carpenters worked through the night by candlelight, in shifts, at the king's impatient expense. The hall rose between 1532 and 1535, 106 feet long, 40 feet wide, crowned with a hammer-beam roof of carved English oak 60 feet above the floor. Henry hung its walls with the story of Abraham, Brussels tapestries woven with so much gold thread that they were valued alongside the crown jewels. And high among the roof timbers, the carvers set small painted faces peering down at the tables below. They are called eavesdroppers. They were put there to remind every soul who dined in that hall that at the Tudor court someone is always listening. The hall had been begun for Anne Boleyn, her initials carved through its fabric, twined with the king's. By the time the roof was finished, she had a year to live. She was beheaded on 19th of May 1536, and the carvers were sent back in to cut her out of the building, stripping her badges and initials at speed. They missed one. High on the great oak screen, an H and an A remained tied together in a lover's knot, 5 centuries after the king ordered the A removed from England. 11 days after the sword came down, Henry married Jane Seymour. Around the hall, the palace swelled to serve a court of 1,000. The kitchens grew to 55 rooms with a staff of 200, producing 2 meals a day for 600 people, washed down with 600,000 gallons of beer a year. The Great House of Easement, a communal lavatory built over the moat's outfall, could seat 28 people at once, on 2 levels. Beyond the hall, Henry raised the Great Watching Chamber, where the yeomen of the guard stood between the court and the door to the king's private world. In the Chapel Royal, carpenters and gilders hung a ceiling of deep blue, ribbed with gold and studded with gilded stars, one of the most beautiful things the Tudor age ever made. And in 1540, the clockmaker Nicholas Orsian mounted an astronomical clock on the inner gatehouse, a machine that put the earth at the center of the universe with the sun circling obediently around it, and told the courtiers the one fact that ruled their day, the hour the tide would turn at London Bridge, the court moved by barge, and even a king waits on the tide. The courtyard beneath it has been called Clock Court ever since, and the clock still keeps its beautiful, wrong cosmos turning. Henry spent more money on Hampton Court than on almost any other building he owned. He laid out a tilt yard for tournaments, watched from 5 viewing towers, built bowling alleys and a real tennis court, and kept the park stocked with deer for the hunt. Under Henry, the house became the engine room of a travelling government. The Privy Council met here. Ambassadors were staged and dazzled here, and the whole vast machine ran to the rhythm of the kitchens and the tide. All 6 of his marriages passed through these courtyards, and half of them ended in ways the guidebooks still soften. By the late 1530s, Hampton Court was the most modern palace in Europe. It was also beginning to collect its dead. In September 1537, Queen Jane took to her chamber at Hampton Court to await her child. The whole weight of the Tudor dynasty pressed on that one room. 2 wives had failed to give Henry a living son. One had been discarded, one beheaded. On the 12th of October, 1537, after a labour that lasted 2 days and 3 nights, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy boy, Edward. England finally had its male heir. In London, the church bells rang all day, bonfires burned in the streets, and the Tower guns fired a 2,000-round salute. 3 days later, the prince was christened at midnight in the Chapel Royal, borne through the palace in a procession of hundreds, his half-sister Mary standing godmother. The 4-year-old Elizabeth carried in the train. Jane, wrapped in velvet and furs, received the court's congratulations from her bed. Then came the fever, puerperal sepsis, the childbed infection that killed queens and cottagers alike, and against which the finest physicians in the kingdom had nothing. She rallied and sank and rallied. On 24th October 1537, 12 days after handing Henry the son he had broken a church to get, Jane Seymour died in her rooms at Hampton Court. She was about 28 years old. Henry wore black for 3 months. Her body went in slow procession to Windsor, where the king reserved the place beside her for himself, the only one of his 6 wives he chose to lie with in death. But her heart never left. It was buried in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, a few yards from where her son had been christened 12 days before she died. Within weeks, a woman named Sybil Penn was hired as dry nurse to the motherless prince. Hold on to that name. The house does. The 4th marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was a diplomatic contract the king found he could not stomach, and it was annulled, unconsummated, on 9th of July, 1540. Henry was now 49. The ulcerated leg that would torment him to his grave had to be drained and dressed daily, and courtiers claimed they could smell it from rooms away. He believed sincerely that he was in love again, and that he was lovable. 19 days after the annulment, he married a teenager. On 28th of July, 1540, at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, Henry VIII married his 5th wife. On the same morning, on Tower Hill, Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had arranged the 4th marriage, knelt at the block and was beheaded. The bride was Catherine Howard, niece of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. The king was 49. His new queen was about 17. To understand what happened at Hampton Court 16 months later, you have to understand where Catherine came from. She was one of the many children of Lord Edmund Howard, a chronically penniless younger son of the great Howard clan. Her mother died when she was small, and the girl was parked in the vast, lightly supervised household of her step-grandmother, Agnes. Dowager Duchess of Norfolk at Chesworth House near Horsham, and at Norfolk House in Lambeth. Dozens of young wards slept in shared dormitories. The Duchess kept the keys at night and believed that was sufficient. It was not. When Catherine was perhaps 13, her music master, a man named Henry Manox, began what the later testimony describes with terrible Tudor plainness. He was a grown man employed to teach a child the virginals, and he abused the position. When she was around 15, a gentleman of the household named Francis Derham, about 14 years her senior, got into her bed. The dormitory testimony is explicit. They called each other husband and wife. They exchanged tokens, and in Tudor law, that exchange of promises may have amounted to a binding pre-contract of marriage. Nobody protected her. Several adults in the household knew and filed the knowledge away for later use. Modern historians read her very differently from the Victorians, who wrote her off as a wanton. Gareth Russell, whose 2017 biography, Young and Damned and Fair, is the fullest account of her life, sees a girl failed and then destroyed by the adults around her, groomed at perhaps 13, taken to bed at 15, married at 17 to an ailing, dangerous man of 49 who had already buried one wife and beheaded another, and managed throughout by relatives who profited from her rise and denounced her at her fall. At every stage of the story, the adults win and the girl pays. In the autumn of 1539, her uncle the Duke placed her at court as a maid of honour to the incoming Queen Anne of Cleves. The king noticed her within weeks. When the Cleves marriage was annulled, the Howards saw the open door and pushed their niece through it. Her motto as queen was chosen for her, no other will but his. Henry called her his rose without a thorn, and showered her with the jewels of her divorced and beheaded predecessors. For a year, the old king was visibly, embarrassingly happy. Then there was Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, young, well-favoured, and trusted enough to sleep in the king's own bedchamber and help dress the royal leg. By the spring of 1541, the Queen was meeting him in secret. The meetings were arranged by the strangest figure in the whole story, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, one of Catherine's ladies of the bedchamber, and the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, whose destruction her own testimony had helped secure 5 years before. Why she chose to stand watch on back stairs for a second doomed queen is a question historians have never been able to answer. In the summer of 1541, the court rode north on the greatest royal progress of the reign to overawe Yorkshire and meet the King of Scots, who never came. At Lincoln, at Pontefract, at York, while the king slept, Lady Rochford kept watch, and Catherine met Culpeper on back stairs and in borrowed chambers. The Queen's own words survive in the only letter in her hand that has come down to us, written to Culpeper that spring or summer, and held today in the National Archives at Kew, catalogued as SP 1/167. It maketh my heart die to think what fortune I have, that I cannot be always in your company. She signed it, yours, as long as life endures, Catherine. Life had less than a year left to endure. That August, at Pontefract, Frances Derham reappeared out of her Lambeth past and was appointed the Queen's private secretary. The appointment has blackmail written through every line of it. A man who could prove the Queen had a history now stood inside her household, paid from her purse. The court returned to Hampton Court at the end of October 1541. On the 1st November, All Saints' Day, Henry ordered his confessor to give public thanks to God for the jewel of a wife he had been granted after so many troubled marriages. He was, by then, perhaps the only man in the chapel who did not know, because while the king had been in the north, a courtier named John Lascelles had come quietly to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Lascelles was a religious reformer with no love for the conservative Howards, and he carried a story from his sister, Mary Hall, who had served in the Dowager Duchess's household and had watched Catherine's girlhood at close range. Manox, Derham, the dormitory, the words, husband and wife. Cranmer checked what could be checked and understood that he was holding gunpowder. He also understood that burying it, if it later surfaced, would cost him his own head. But no man alive dared say such things to Henry VIII's face. So he wrote them down on the 2nd of November, 1541. All Souls' Day, the day the church prays for its dead, Thomas Cranmer walked into the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court and left a sealed letter on the king's seat in the royal pew, where Henry would find it when he came to Mass. Then he withdrew and waited. Henry read it and did not believe a word of it. He ordered a quiet investigation, chiefly, he said, to clear the Queen's name. Within days it had done the opposite. Manox, questioned, confessed to the abuse at Lambeth. Derham, arrested and questioned far harder, confessed to the nights in the dormitory, and then, fighting for his life, said the one sentence that turned an old embarrassment into fresh treason. He himself had never returned to the Queen's bed after her marriage, because Culpeper had succeeded him in the Queen's affections. On 4th November 1541, Catherine was confined to her rooms at Hampton Court. Her keys were taken. Guards were posted at her doors. She was about 18 years old, and she understood precisely what happened to queens of England accused of adultery, because it had happened to her own first cousin, Anne Boleyn, 5 years earlier. It is from these days that the palace's most famous story dates. The tradition holds that Catherine broke free of her guards and ran the length of the long gallery leading towards the Chapel Royal, hammering at the locked door, screaming for the husband, hearing Mass on the other side, until the guards caught her and dragged her back. No contemporary document records the run. It enters the written record much later, once the gallery already had its reputation. What the documents do record is a terrified girl held in those rooms, in those exact days, yards from a husband who would not see her. Whether or not her feet ever crossed those floorboards at speed, the gallery has been called the Haunted Gallery for some 200 years, and it is her name the palace attaches to it. On 11th of November 1541, Cranmer interrogated her at Hampton Court. His report to the king survives. He found her, he wrote, in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, swinging between frozen calm and fits of frenzy, in which he feared for her reason. She admitted what had happened at Lambeth, but denied any pre-contract with Derham, insisting he had forced her. It was the one denial that may have doomed her. A binding pre-contract would have made her royal marriage void from the start, and her offence something less than treason. She may never have understood the single door the law had left open. On the 14th of November, she was taken by barge to Sion Abbey, upstream, to a reduced household and plain gowns. She never saw Henry again. She never saw Hampton Court again. On the 1st December 1541, at Guildhall in London, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were tried for treason, with the Duke of Norfolk himself sitting among the judges of his niece's alleged lovers. Both men were convicted. On 10th of December 1541, at Tyburn, Culpeper, as a gentleman, was beheaded. Derham suffered the full sentence and was hanged, drawn and quartered. Their heads were set on spikes above London Bridge. Norfolk, whose family had now supplied the king with 2 condemned queens, saved himself in writing, denouncing the abominable deeds of his nieces and grovelling for the king's favour. It worked. The uncle who had pushed the girl through the door kept his head, his dukedom and his offices. Parliament did the rest. There would be no trial for the Queen. On 21st of January 1542, the Act of Attainder against Catherine passed, condemning her and Lady Rochford to death by the stroke of a pen. On 10th of February, she was taken by river to the Tower, her barge passing beneath London Bridge, beneath the spikes where the heads of Culpeper and Derham still stood. On the evening of 12th of February, she asked for the block to be brought to her room and practised how to kneel and where to lay her head, so that she would not fail at the last thing in front of a crowd. On the morning of the 13th of February 1542, she was led out to Tower Green, to a scaffold on the spot where Anne Boleyn had died. She was so weak she needed help climbing the steps. She spoke briefly, professed her faith, and asked the crowd to pray for the king. The axe took her with a single stroke. Jane, Lady Rochford, followed her within minutes. They were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, hard against the Tower wall, near Anne Boleyn. 2 first cousins, 2 queens of England, in the same small chapel, put there by the same husband. You may have heard that she said, on the scaffold, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." She almost certainly said no such thing. The line appears in no contemporary account. It surfaces generations later, polished by retelling. What we actually have is an eyewitness. Otwell Johnson, a London merchant, stood in the crowd that morning and wrote to his brother 2 days later that she made the most godly and Christian end that ever was heard tell of, uttering her lively faith in the blood of Christ only. The legend gives her a lover's defiance. The record gives us a frightened teenager doing the last thing ever asked of her, and doing it well. The record is harder to bear. The evidence has not gone anywhere. Her letter to Culpeper sits at Kew, the ink browned, the signature still legible. The royal pew, where Cranmer left his letter, still looks down into the Chapel Royal. The gallery is on the public route, and you can walk it any day the palace is open. And under the altar pavement of St. Peter ad Vincula, the two Howard cousins lie a few feet apart. On the 24th August 1647, a king arrived at Hampton Court under guard. The house had already ruined a cardinal and buried a queen and destroyed a teenager, and it received Charles III with the same neutral splendour it offered everyone. He was a prisoner of the new model army, the force his own war had called into being, and his captivity was a strange, velvet thing. He kept servants and chaplains. He hunted in the park. His younger children were brought to visit him, and hardened officers of the army wept to watch him hold them. Oliver Cromwell himself came to dine, and negotiations for a settlement crawled on through the autumn. But by November, the king was hearing warnings, some real, some planted, that radicals in the army meant to kill him. On the evening of 11th of November, 1647, he slipped out of his rooms by the back stairs, crossed the privy garden in the dark, and was gone down the river before his guards found the letters he had left behind on his table. It was the worst escape in Stuart history. He fled to the Isle of Wight, to Carisbrooke Castle, whose governor promptly locked him up for Parliament. 14 months later, on 30th of January 1649, he was beheaded in front of Whitehall. The garden he escaped through led, by the long way round, to the scaffold. The Republic sold the king's paintings, but it kept his palace. Cromwell, Lord Protector by 1653, spent his weekends at Hampton Court, hunting the same deer and sleeping in the same lodgings as the tyrants he had replaced. The house absorbed the Republic as it had absorbed everything else. Monarchy returned in 1660, and the palace waited for its next dangerous owner. He arrived in 1689, and he came with an architect. William III was asthmatic, and the smoke of Whitehall was killing him. He and Mary II wanted clean river air and a palace to rival Versailles. They gave the job to Christopher Wren, who proposed to demolish the whole Tudor palace except the Great Hall and raise a new one in its place. The wrecking crews started at once. Half the Tudor palace came down, including the royal lodgings where Henry's queens had lived, and in their place rose Fountain Court and the king's and queen's state apartments, pink brick and Portland stone. France answered in English materials. The work was driven so fast that in December 1689, part of the new building collapsed, killing 2 workmen and injuring others. Wren was pressed on regardless. Then, on 28th of December 1694, Mary died of smallpox at Kensington. She was 32. William, who had loved her far more than he had ever managed to show her, stopped the works dead. For years, the palace stood half Tudor and half Baroque, a building site with grief where the money used to be. That is the only reason the Tudor half survives today. Not conservation, bereavement. The palace, 1 million people now photograph, exists because a queen died and the funding stopped. William eventually finished the state apartments and came to like the place. It repaid him the way the house repays affection. On 21st February 1702, he was riding his horse Sorrel in Hampton Court Park when the animal stumbled on a molehill and threw him. The king broke his collarbone. Complications settled on his weak lungs, and on the 8th of March of 1702, he died. For a generation afterwards, Jacobites who wanted the Stuarts back drank a quiet toast to the mole that dug the hill, to the little gentleman in black velvet. The Georgians used the palace, then drifted away from it. George II held court here in the 1730s, and after 1737, no reigning monarch ever lived at Hampton Court again. The greatest palace in England became, by slow degrees, a residence without a resident, and the Crown found it a new purpose: grace and favour. The building was carved into dozens of apartments and granted, rent-free, to the widows and dependents of men who had served the Crown, admirals' relicts, generals' daughters, courtiers' orphans. For 2 centuries and more, the palace of Henry VIII was a vertical village of elderly ladies, coal fires, cats, and paraffin heaters. The arrangement lasted into the late 20th century, and it wrote the palace's last death. On the night of 31st of March 1986, in a grace and favour apartment high in Wren's south wing, a candle started a fire that got into the roof spaces. It was discovered in the small hours, and by dawn, the top of the south wing was burning through. Staff, curators, and firefighters formed chains to carry irreplaceable paintings and furniture out onto the lawns while the hoses played over the state apartments. The roof of the cartoon gallery was destroyed, and Lady Daphne Gale, 86 years old, the widow of General Sir Richard Gale, who had commanded airborne troops on D-Day, died in the apartment where the fire began. The restoration of the South Wing took 9 years and was completed in 1995, and it retrained a generation of craftsmen in skills the building trades had half forgotten. Hand-carved limewood, gilding laid leaf by leaf, oak roofs framed the way Wren's carpenters had framed them. The fire also marked the beginning of the end for the grace and favour arrangement itself. A palace could no longer be both a museum of national treasures and an unsupervised retirement home with open flames. And then there is the footage. In October 2003, palace security staff found a set of fire doors near an exhibition area standing open 3 days in a row. They checked the CCTV. On the first day, the recording showed the doors bursting open with no one near them. On the second day, the doors flew open again, and a figure stepped out of the darkness into the doorway in what appeared to be period-style robes, took hold of both doors and closed them. The palace checked its costumed interpreters. Nobody had been there, and no costume on the books matched the one on the tape. Historic royal palaces released the clip. The world's press nicknamed the figure Skeletor, and the story ran on every continent. No explanation was ever established. The palace has never claimed it was a ghost. It has also never been able to say what it was. But the palace that astonishes the million visitors who queue at the Great Gatehouse each year was not built or run or saved by the kings whose arms are carved above its archways. It was built and run and saved by people whose names survive, when they survive at all, in wage books. Their presence at Hampton Court is documented, recorded in ink on paper, in kitchen accounts and household lists and pension files. Their stories are not. Sybil Penn came to the palace within weeks of Jane Seymour's death, hired as dry nurse to the motherless Prince Edward. She stayed for 25 years and served 4 Tudor monarchs. She raised Henry's heir, kept her place under Edward VI and Mary I, and in 1562, when Elizabeth I lay close to death from smallpox at Hampton Court, it was Sybil Penn who nursed her through it. The Queen survived. The nurse did not. She caught the disease from her patient and died on the 6th of November 1562 and was buried at St Mary's Church in Hampton with a monument showing her at rest. For 2.5 centuries she slept undisturbed. Then, in 1829, the old church was pulled down for rebuilding, and her tomb was moved and her grave disturbed. And the reports began. A tall woman in grey, seen in the palace's staterooms and corridors, and, from lodgings she had once used, the sound of a spinning wheel working behind a wall where no room was known to exist. When the wall was opened, the story goes, workmen found a small sealed chamber containing a spinning wheel. She is the Grey Lady of Hampton Court. We know she served the Tudors longer than most of their ministers survived them. We know she gave her life for her last patient. What she thought of the family she spent it on, we do not know. In the 1540s, the master cook of the Kingside kitchen was a man named John Brickett. The Tudor kitchen accounts that survive in the National Archives record the machine he helped drive. a staff of 200 feeding 600 courtiers twice a day, through 8,000 sheep and 1,240 oxen a year. Brickett's kingdom was the roasting range, where boys turned iron spits before open fires in 6-hour shifts, basted in their own sweat. His wage was £4 a year, plus his livery and his lodging. We know his name. We know his wage. We know the size of the fires he commanded. We know nothing else. Not his face, not his family, not where he lies buried. 4 centuries later, the books were still being kept. Emily Rush joined the palace staff in 1952 as a housemaid in the Grace and Favour apartments and stayed for 34 years, serving 11 widowed residents across her tenure, carrying trays and coal scuttles up staircases built for a cardinal. On the night of 31st March 1986, she helped evacuate elderly residents from the burning South Wing. Lady Gale, whom she had served for 9 years, could not be reached. Rush was pensioned in 1987. We know the number of her ladies. We know the length of her service. We know what she did on the worst night of it. What that night cost her, the files do not say. They appear in the records as footnote, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. A nurse becomes a ghost story. A cook becomes a line in an account book. A housemaid becomes a pension number. We know only that they were there, and that the palace they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them because the Tudor kitchens and the royal household kept their accounts, and nobody threw the books away. The kings made the history. The servants made the house. The house absorbed both. In November 1838, a 19-year-old queen gave Hampton Court to everyone. Victoria, barely a year on the throne, ordered the state apartments open to the public, free of charge, one of the first royal buildings anywhere in the world thrown open to ordinary people. They came by steamer and carriage, and then the railway arrived, and they came in their hundreds of thousands. Clerks and seamstresses and families with picnic baskets walking the same gallery where a queen was said to have run screaming, most of them never knowing it. In the year of the Great Exhibition alone, hundreds of thousands walked its staterooms, and a palace built to keep almost everyone out became one of the first great buildings in the world that existed to let everyone in. Today, the palace is in the care of Historic Royal Palaces, an independent charity that receives no funding from the government or the Crown, and around 1 million visitors a year pay its bills. What they get for the ticket is not one attraction, but a dozen. The maze, planted around 1700 for William III, a third of an acre of hornbeam and yew, with half a mile of paths, in which visitors have been cheerfully losing themselves for 3 centuries. The Great Vine, planted in 1768 under Lancelot Capability Brown, now the oldest known grapevine in the world, its single stem thicker than a man's waist, still producing an annual crop of black dessert grapes that is cut and sold in the palace shops every autumn. Each July, the showgrounds fill for the Hampton Court Palace Flower Show, among the largest flower shows on earth, and the Chapel Royal, 500 years on, is not a museum piece at all. It remains a working church. Choral services sung beneath Henry's blue and gold ceiling. A congregation at prayer above the place where Jane Seymour's heart was laid. In the Tudor kitchens, the fires are lit, and food historians cook from 16th century recipes so that the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifts into Base Court, which still stands in its bones as Wolsey left it. Beneath the astronomical clock, the machine Nicholas Ocean built in 1540 still tells the hour the tide turns at London Bridge, for royal barges that stopped coming 300 years ago, and the palace does not hide its darker inheritance. The Haunted Gallery is on the main visitor route, plainly labelled. In 1999, in 2 separate incidents, visitors fainted on the same spot in the gallery, and palace staff logged both events, a detail that did the ghost story more good than any Victorian pamphlet ever had. 2 years later, a team of psychologists brought hundreds of volunteers into the gallery to map where the strange experiences clustered and trace some of the cold spots and sudden dread to concealed doorways leaking chilled air. But the explanation covered some of the reports, not all of them, and the palace was content to publish that finding too. Through the dark months, the palace runs ghost tours after closing, lantern light on 500 years of brick. And when the fire door footage went around the world in 2003, Historic Royal Palaces published it with a shrug rather than a sermon. The figure was never identified. The palace's own security team asked for a verdict, could offer only the honest one. It remains a mystery. The building keeps tenants still, of a quieter kind. The Royal School of Needlework has occupied apartments here since 1987, its embroiderers working above courtyards where seamstresses once stitched for Henry's wardrobe, and conservation teams wage a permanent, unglamorous war against damp beetle and 5 centuries of gravity because a palace of 1,000 rooms is never finished, only defended. The last of the grace and favour ladies grew old and left, and their apartments became offices and exhibition rooms and workshops. The house changed around everyone, as it always has. That is how it survives its owners. Stand at the Great Gatehouse on a November afternoon. Stand at the Great Gatehouse on a November afternoon, when the coach parties have gone and the light is dropping into the river, and let the building complicate itself in front of you. The gatehouse is 2 stories shorter than the one Wolsey raised. Its unsafe upper floors were taken down in the 18th century, so even the palace's proudest face is an edit. The moat has been filled in and dug out again. The brick has been repointed by 10 generations of hands. The emperors in their terracotta roundels rescued and restored. The great gardens replanted over and over to match paintings of themselves. Base Court is presented immaculately as Wolsey left it, which is itself an act of curated memory, because Wolsey's court was mud and smoke and 500 servants and the din of a small town. What you are looking at is not the past, it is the building the past keeps being rebuilt into, and the accidents of survival run deeper than the restorations. The Great Hall stands because Wren was ordered to spare it. The Tudor half stands because a queen died of smallpox and the money stopped. The South Wing stands because firefighters and housemaids held a line against the flames one March night in 1986. Almost nothing about what you are seeing was inevitable. The house is a survivor pretending to be a monument. Hampton Court is not one house. It is the record, in red brick and Portland stone, of what closeness to power costs the people who come closest. Wolsey wanted proof that a butcher's son could stand above dukes. The house gave him the proof, and the proof helped destroy him. Henry wanted a son. The house gave him one, and took the boy's mother 12 days later. Catherine Howard wanted to outrun her childhood. The house delivered her childhood to the king's seat in the chapel. Charles I wanted a door out. The house gave him the privy garden, and the garden led in time to a scaffold. Cromwell wanted the pleasures of a king without the crown. The house gave him the deer park and kept its opinion to itself. William wanted Versailles. The house gave him half of one, and its park supplied the molehill. The grace and favour widows wanted somewhere warm to grow old. The house gave them that too, until the night it burned. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. And beneath the givers and the takers, always the carriers. Sybil Penn, who nursed the dynasty for 25 years and was paid with smallpox in life and a legend in death. John Brickett, at his roasting fires, £4 a year. Emily Rush, on the night stairs of a burning wing, counting her ladies. So who does a building like this belong to? The cardinal who raised it and gave it away. The king who took it and filled it with wives. The queen whose heart is under the chapel. The girl whose scream the gallery is named for. The nurse whose disturbed grave began a haunting. The cook at his spits. The housemaid with her trays. The charity that keeps the roof dry. The million strangers a year who walk through wondering which floorboard it was. Or the figure on the security tape, whoever or whatever it was, closing the doors of the place as if it still worked there. Hampton Court does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands on its bend of the Thames, brick going dark in the winter rain, the wrong and beautiful cosmos still turning on its clock, and lets you decide. But before you leave, walk the gallery one more time. At its end is the chapel royal door, and beyond the door, the royal pew, where a sealed letter waited on the king's seat on All Souls' Day 1541, left by an archbishop who dared not say the words aloud. Between you and that door lies the stretch of floor where a 17-year-old queen is said to have run screaming for a husband who did not open it, and where visitors 5 centuries later have dropped to the same flagstones in a dead faint. And in a climate-controlled archive at Kew, there is a single sheet of paper in her hand, in a teenager's looping script, ending with the words, "Yours as long as life endures." Life endured 6 more months. The palace does not claim that she walks. It only keeps the gallery open and writes down what happens there. She is still up there. She always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.